That's the other thing about publishing and funding is you have to have a thick skin for this work.
Yeah.
And the more you do, and the more feedback you get, the thicker it'll get and the easier it will get.
From Research to Real Life, a podcast brought to you by the Clinical and Translational Science Collaborative of Northern Ohio.
Welcome to From Research to Real Life. This is our final episode of season 2. So welcome to the two of you. We're going to get into introductions here in a moment. I'm your host, Lora Parent. Today's episode talks about something that is very central to every research career, and that is funding and publishing. I don't think we talk about it very often. When we talk about it, it's because of how successful it is and maybe not the challenges of it. So I'm excited to dive in today to talk a little bit more about how rewarding, but also challenging that can be. So join with me today. I have Dr. Ian Neeland. Welcome. He is our CTSC Pilot co-lead. He is also the director at University Hospital's Center for Cardiovascular Prevention. He's a clinical investigator in cardiometabolic disease. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
We also have with us Dr. Amar Desai. He's also the CTSC Pilot Program co-lead, and he's an assistant professor at Case Western Reserve University, the Comprehensive Cancer Center, and he's a translational researcher in pharmacology. So welcome to you as well.
Yeah, thanks. Excited to be here.
Today, we are talking about funding, some publishing, some of the challenges alongside of that. Both of you are very versed in funding because also you're helping guide our CTSC members through that process, through our pilot program. But I really am interested today to talk about your research journeys and what funding has meant to you, and maybe what are some things that you've encountered along the way with respect to national NIH funding, with respect to maybe some private or philanthropic funding. But I'm also very curious, as the human component, what happens when maybe something doesn't go your way, when you don't get that funding, and what next? I don't think we talk about that quite often enough. Ian, I'd like to start with you. Tell us a little bit about your research journey. What does that look like, and what role has funding really played in your career journey?
Sure. I first started kind of getting interested in research a little bit in high school. Went to the state science fair and presented on a project that I did. And then in medical school, like many medical students, did some research. It was really basic science research at that time. That's mostly what medical students kind of have access to. Never really spoke to me per se. And so in residency, I got more involved in clinical research and started to get interested in cardiology, cardiovascular disease research, and had some good experiences. And then after residency, the decision was whether or not I actually wanted to do research as a significant component of my career or not, and to give myself the greatest chance at figuring that out and being successful. I actually did a research first fellowship, so it was on a T32 grant in Texas, where it was 2 years of research up front and then 2 years of clinical work in cardiovascular disease. And that really opened the door to my research career and led to all the subsequent things that I've done since. Funding, though, didn't really become on top of mind until the very end of my fellowship, when I was about to transition to faculty, and a K-23 award came up in terms of securing funding as a career development to then move toward independent funding later on. And the great thing was that I had fantastic mentorship and a great institution and a place to grow and learn. And I was successful in securing a K-23 grant right out of fellowship into faculty. And that really jump-started my career. From then on, funding has been much more important and center in terms of making sure that I can continue my research career, that I have time to do so, and the ability to do different things. So now, at this point in my career, I guess I would call it mid-career, is that funding is a big component of it, obviously, and so really just trying to keep things going, do different things, look at different sources of funding, be flexible and facile in terms of getting funding from everywhere. I mean, I think I had a mentor along the way who made a great point that there are a lot of sources of funding out there, and at the end of the day, right? If you have funding to support your work and you're doing the work you want to do, then that's what matters, right? It doesn't really matter where the money comes from. But but it's always a daunting, challenging task. And something I think gives a lot of researchers anxiety, and sometimes they'll sleep well at night because of it. But it's just kind of the part of living as a researcher, and something that we have to do. And there's ways to learn and to get better at it, and that's why I think that help people can listen to this discussion today to kind of learn some tips and tricks, I think, to help them along.
Yeah. A couple of things that are popping out when you talk about your journey is that mentorship, collaboration. I think all of these things have been the most common phrases that we've heard doing our podcast, and how critical that is, not only in research, but the goals that you hope to achieve throughout your career journey. Is that it's not only attributed to the work that you're doing, but how other people have helped that along the way, and maybe have paved the way, at times as well. Mm-hmm. Learning from their mistakes, I think, is something that proves to be incredibly helpful. Mm-hmm. And what about you, Amar? Let's talk about your research journey and what that looks like.
Yeah, sure. And before I get started, I should say that for my clinician scientist friends and colleagues like Ian, I'm constantly amazed at how you're able to find time to seek out and apply for funding, because, as a basic science researcher who runs a cancer research lab, I would say the vast majority of my day is thinking about and writing grants. And so the idea that someone like Ian and his, physician scientist colleagues can find time to also carve out dedicated mental space to think and write is pretty baffling. So I gotta give you some credit.
Well, at the same token, the PhDs, they spend, like you said, a lot of time doing it, and I'm always amazed at the persistence and the prowess that they have with doing funding. So if you ever want to know how to write a grant, you talk to a PhD basic science researcher.
Yeah, persistence is probably the right word there. Yeah, so my story, similar to Ian, I got really interested in research during my undergraduate. I went to Kenyon College, for a long period of time. I really thought I was going to be a creative writer. And then you go to a school like Kenyon and you realize your creative talents and your writing ability are quite subpar compared to actually creative and talented people. And so I sort of, pivoted to what I might have actually been good at, which was research and science. And after a couple of really exciting and fulfilling summer internships during undergrad, I realized I wanted to go get a PhD and study cancer biology. In large part, that was due to a summer experience I had in 2007, which was here at Case Western in the pharmacology department summer research program. Mm-hmm. Sort of fell in love with Case, fell in love with the environment, was really just amazed at how much collaboration and how much really innovative science are coming from sort of really breakthrough sort of scientists at the forefront of their fields. So I went to Case for my PhD. I think I realized really early on the importance of funding, even in a graduate student's career, because I was given the advice from senior graduate students and junior faculty who told me, your PI is going to like you more if you're funded. Life gets a lot easier if you're a funded graduate student, because your stipend and your some of your expenses are not on your PI's or your research mentors' books, right? Mm-hmm. And so then, I sort of really early started seeking out T32 opportunities either within the university or on a national level. And what's great about Case is, a lot of departments sponsor T32s, which means, they will pay for students to sit on their training grants, get trained under their departments, but you can still work in any lab that you want. And so, I took that advice to heart and was funded, I believe, 5 of my 6 years of graduate school through the T32, through the Department of Pharmacology, and then through the Department of Cell and Molecular Biology. And the big advice there to graduate students or to young scientists is you got to learn how to sell yourself and your science. And storytelling becomes incredibly important there. And so when I transitioned to my postdoc, which was also at Case, sort of followed that same path, which is I know my postdoc mentor in this case is going to appreciate my contributions to the lab even more if I'm funded. And so I went out and secured a T32 that was offered by the University of Rutgers. It's a consortium between several institutions, and Case was one. So for the first 2 years of my postdoc, I was funded by that T32, which then led me to apply for, similar to Ian, a K award. and I received a K99 R00 award, which is it's called the Pathway to Independence Award from the NIH, which I was very lucky enough to get funded the second half of my postdoc. So, since then, similar to Ian, I think every minute of every day, much to my family chagrin, I'm thinking about funding. And we've had some success, but persistence is really the most important thing here. And so always writing, always seeking new funding opportunities. And we can get into some of those later, but that's sort of the big picture of how I got here.
Sure. Now, one thing that I've noticed in my time working through the CTSC is that funding has changed over time. What the NIH is funding, how we're funding it, and also number of funding opportunities have either increased or decreased over time. What do you think that means? I mean, I see what that means for, the CTSC in general and in our researchers, but with your opinions, how do you think that the changing or evolving landscape has affected either how you research or what that means for the outlook, the future moving forward?
Sure. So from a PhD's point of view, NIH funding is at a really critically low funding rate at the moment. If you're applying to NCI, it's single digits. Every other institution, we've been funded by the NIA, the National Institute on Aging, the NHLBI, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. The funding rates, so they're typically, in the past, they've been thought of in terms of percentages. So if I submit a grant, I would get a percent, and that percent could be 15%, which means that of all of the other grants that were submitted that cycle, mine is in the top 15%. And previously, even when I first started my lab in 2019, that number, that right around 15% could get your grant funded, which means you had to beat out 85 of 100 other people. And if you were that good and that lucky, then you could get funded. Now those numbers are dropping. I'm hearing anecdotal stories of folks who are scoring 7% or 8% and still not sure if their grants are going to get funded. So the impact on academic science and the biomedical research field in general is, in my opinion, really, really, I don't want to say catastrophic, but that is how I feel at times, which is it's incredibly hard to get funded. And I was already submitting every cycle, and now I'm trying to submit 2 to 3 grants every cycle, which is, ultimately going to dilute my ability to focus on a project. And then also, the likelihood of funding continues to go down, which forces, myself and many of my colleagues to think creatively about how we spend in the lab, how we hire, how we allocate resources for projects. And we're sort of forced to prioritize projects that we think have the highest likelihood of being funded rather than those that might be the most exciting or the most innovative. And that's it's a very scary prospect.
Yeah, it's a tough balance, I would imagine.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it takes hundreds of hours to write a grant. And when you send it off and it comes back and it's not even discussed at a study section meeting, it's going to be very dejecting. But, again, you have to kind of be facile in this day and age. I think when I first started, and even before that, a lot of grants were kind of one PI, one team, and that was it. And now things are moving a lot more towards collaborative science, multiple different disciplines, expertise coming together. People like that a lot more. I think that funding is easier to get if you have a team science approach to things. I do think the pay line has gone down significantly over time. But that's really more for kind of independent award grants like an R01. Whereas I still think for career development grants for kind of junior faculty and younger scientists that it's easier. So like when I did my K, I think the pay line was 35% with an HLBI, and so and an ITDK. So it's like that's definitely doable, right? And so I think don't get discouraged when you're just starting out in terms of funding. It's a lot easier to get funding for career development awards than it is towards later on. And the other thing is that once you get funded successfully, the chances of further funding is higher. So you learn from what you've done wrong in the past. You learn how to be a better grant writer, a better scientist, and where funding can come from, and also how to allocate resources, I think. And so it gets easier from that standpoint. So the other thing I think that's changed is into translational science, for example, right? Implementation science. I don't think implementation science was much of a thing, 15, 20 years ago. And the funding for that probably was much lower. Now there's a lot of interest in it. And so there's people who are interested in implementation science and doing that kind of work. It's somewhat easier for them now than it was before. But everything changes. The budget's always changing with every administration. Things change. But I think persistence, as Amar said earlier, is the key here.
Yeah. Well, even the CTSC, when we first started almost 20 years ago now, was all basic science, cells, mice. And now we are not funding any of that.
Yeah.
Over time that shift, we've gone more translational end of that spectrum, bench to bedside. So, even what we're funding and what we choose to fund and what people can apply for funding, it is kind of heartbreaking to have to tell somebody, I'm sorry, we can't fund your project, because ultimately they internalize that, right? Fortunately, there are other places to look for funding, which is great. But I'm actually quite curious, and both of you alluded to this, is how do you balance then your regular workload while you're trying to revise and resubmit?
I mean, I think you have to be very good with time management, and make sure you have the appropriate balance. Like I said, hundreds of hours can go into a grant, and a few people can look at it for 20 minutes, and that's it. I mean, it could be very disheartening if you think of it that way. I think you have to look at everything you do as a learning experience to make it better, right? And so if you have a grant that you spend a ton of time on and you put your whole effort into it and it comes back as maybe triaged, then that's okay. You revise, resubmit, keep going. And I think trying to separate your success in funding and getting and publishing, for that matter, and your worth as a scientist, as a person, as a faculty member, as a teacher, you need to separate those two things out. I remember that I spoke with one of my mentors, and he was telling me about somebody else who his whole self-worth was tied up in is he going to get an R01 or not? If he doesn't get the R01, is it all not worth it? That perspective is going to lead to failure, because 9 times out of 10, the top scientists in the world may not get the funding. It's a lot of times happens to be what's going on right then in society and science, who's reviewing it, how it's reviewed. And so, ultimately it's not up to you. You have to put your best foot forward and do the best you can. But it's, you shouldn't take it personally, right?
Yeah.
As they say, it's just business. So, I think that's the best way to approach it. And also have a balance, because if you can get burnt out pretty easily, working on a grant all the time,
Totally.
Yeah.
I didn't really give a full introduction, but we run a hematology oncology drug development based research lab. So we're interested in developing therapeutics to treat heme malignancies and promote stem cell function. So, for my scenario, I have a team of researchers that are in our lab space, and then I'm in the office, right? And so the way that I've found to really be able to balance that time, and for me, focus the majority of my time on writing, is really good training and mentorship to my team. And I hope if they're watching this, they would agree with the fact that, I try very hard to distill independence in my team as quickly as possible, which is, at times it's going to feel like trial by fire. You're going to jump in the deep end of the pool. But guess what? When you got out, you designed this experiment, you executed it, you analyzed it, and then you're presenting to me sort of next steps on how to proceed. And that's the most rewarding thing possible. And what that allows me to do, and I'm incredibly grateful, I think we have a really wonderful culture in my lab. And, sometimes I'll hear that like, oh, how did you build that culture? It's necessity, because I cannot do my job unless there's a culture of folks who are willing to run through a wall to sort of answer the questions that we want to ask. And so, if you look at my team now, and, we're small, we're not a big lab, we're not incredibly well funded. We have a senior PhD student and about 8 or 9 undergrads who, we go to Case Western, which is, a top, 25 to 30 school in the world, if you believe it. And so we have an undertapped resource of incredibly talented undergrads, absolutely incredibly talented, who are so much more driven and focused and organized than I was as a 19 or 20-year-old. And so I'm just, I lean hard on a young group of scientists who are continuously proving that instinct right, which is they're going to deliver time and time again. So that's my secret to balance and not work 18 hours a day. I told you I had oatmeal with my kids this morning, and we're going to have dinner together tonight. And that's in large part due to allocating time appropriately and then trusting your team to be able to deliver for you.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to publishing, that's especially true. My experience is giving trainees, younger people, the ability to take a project and own it, and go from
Yeah.
start to finish in terms of writing it, publishing it. You have to go through the motions to learn. And there are tons of bright people out there who are very motivated. And that also allows you to mentor many more people, and not overextend yourself to one individual or one project. You can do a lot at the same time and juggle those areas because you have great people and a great team working together with you. That's what I was given when I was a young, starting out young trainee, and I feel that's so important, that collaboration and being a mentee to a mentor and a mentee relationship, to let them understand how you write, how you revise, especially when the revisions come back from reviewers. How do you understand what they're asking you to do? How do you respond? It's invaluable for learning, and you can't just do it all yourself. That's not gonna help you. It's not gonna help other people, and you're not gonna be as successful.
Yeah. So I'm curious to know. We all know the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. At what point have you told yourselves, do I keep just resubmitting the same topic because this is my passion, versus I think I need to go in a new direction? Have you ever thought that? And let's talk a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm probably clinically insane, and that we
Aren't we all?
We're very proud of the ideas that we have, because we built years and years. My training goes deep, 15 years into understanding mechanisms regulating hematopoietic stem cell biology. And the grants I want to write and the science I want to do involves understanding that biology and then therapeutically modulating that biology to produce outcomes in hematologic malignancy. So we submit 95% of our grants along that topic. Now, I do realize that a lot of reviewer respect for me is going to come from my body of work, the publications that we've had specifically on that topic. And so it's not so easy to just say, hey, let me go submit on another topic, because if you try to enter a field that you have no experience with, or basically no business being in, your reviewers are going to tell you that really quickly. And what Ian says is right. It's hundreds of hours to write a grant. So if I say, I'm going to go jump into Ian's field, I'm going to write cardio-based grant, I'm going to get laughed out of the room. I won't get scored, and I'll have wasted my 200 hours, right? And so, I'm not saying that you get stuck in a certain path, but I chose a path that I still very strongly believe in. And I think what you can do is you can try to sort of hedge a little bit and say, some of my most exciting collaborations now are with researchers outside of my primary field, but I very clearly understand my contribution is my deep specialization in understanding stem cell biology. So we're now applying that to issues like traumatic brain injury. And we're collaborating with Andrew Pieper, who's a brilliant neuroscientist, to study what happens to the blood in the bone marrow following a brain injury. And we're working with Khalid Sosialaoui and Bill Sheeman at Case Western, who are breast cancer researchers, and understanding what happens to the blood system during metastatic breast cancer. So I think the insanity component is I'm never going to stop writing heme-focused grants. I'm willing to sort of blur the lines a little bit in understanding other disease models. But yeah, I think, 50 years from now, I'll still be writing the same type of grant. Maybe it'll be in a different context, though.
That's right.
I think I'm a little more flexible in that aspect and pragmatic, in the sense that a lot of my projects have come through collaborations and areas of the gray lines where I may not have as much expertise as others. Just for example, we're doing a NIH-sponsored project on SGLT2 inhibition in obstructive sleep apnea. I'm a cardiologist. I study cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity. Obstructive sleep apnea is kind of connected, but I'm by no means a sleep specialist. So, but when I collaborate with several different researchers across the country on a post hoc analysis of a clinical trial to look at the relationship between those two things, and it shows some promise, well, that's an opportunity for me to collaborate with a sleep researcher to do a project together and do a clinical trial. So there's several different examples like that I've kind of collaborate on the edge of something, and then that's led to a different role or a new project, a new pathway. And so, I try to do various things, because the more I feel like you can kind of throw at the wall, the more will stick. And so that's kind of how I've taken it. The same thing applies when it comes to revising, a manuscript. What reviewers want, I try to give them as much as possible. I'm also an associate editor for a journal, so I kind of see it on the other side. And the more responsive you are and if you feel like it's not the right thing to do, then you have to have a cogent explanation why not. Then people will respect that and appreciate that, and so you'll get your science published. I think being responsible and flexible for reviewers want, even if you think like, well, I think it's this, but everyone's different perspectives are really helpful. That's why peer review is peer review, because ultimately it makes a better paper. I've had some situations though where they've wanted X, Y, Z that have been, unreasonable to do, and we've had to kind of fight back, so to speak. But that's your job as a scientist to know your science, to be clear about where you think things are going and what they should be. But obviously have humility and be able to take criticism. That's the other thing about publishing and funding is you have to have a thick skin for this work. Yeah. And the more you do, and the more feedback you get, the thicker it'll get and the easier it will get. I remember my very first paper that I sent out to publish. It was to Circulation, which is one of the top journals for cardiology. And the reviewer, I'm pretty sure I know who reviewed it. She was a big person in this field, and I was just entering. I was a fellow, something I was just learning about and finding out my place. And they didn't take it. But my mentor, he said, I disagree. I think you should appeal for it. So I appealed and came back no again. And but what I learned was that first of all, you can't appeal, right? You can always state your case, and if they don't take it in the end, they don't take it. We publish it somewhere else. Yep. It's okay. It'll get published somewhere. I think that everyone wants them in the journal and JAMA and Science and Nature and things like that. But again, just because you publish and don't publish in one of those journals doesn't mean you're a bad scientist. You're not successful. You have to kind of take good with the bad and be flexible like that.
So I'm going to put my therapist hat on here for a second, and I want you to take me back to that moment when you first got that, no. How did you feel about that? And was there kind of this mindset of, what did I get myself into? Do I even want to put in 100 more hours to do this again and just get the same answer?
Yeah, no, you have to take a deep breath, and it's a lot of work. It's not fun to get a rejection, but as Amar said, you have to be persistent, and you have to keep doing it and keep working at it. No one submits a paper and then it's like gets accepted immediately and everyone loves it. I've seen that one time in my life.
The unicorn.
Yeah. But most times it's 1-2 revisions, maybe more. I mean, who knows? I tell trainees that when the time it starts to write a paper to get it published can be a year or more. That is shocking to most people. Yeah. As a clinician, right? When I first started in research, I was like, things happen right away when you do work. But here, in research, the time horizon is so long, and so you just have to buckle in and go in for the long haul, because that's how you're going to be successful. If you want instant gratification, research is not for you.
Oh, so
yeah, I think that's right. I think that's very well stated. And also to add on to that, I think the no is the norm now, and that very much goes along with what Ian's saying, which is, most experiments you run aren't going to work. None of your publications are going to get accepted on the first try. You're going to have to go through 2 rounds of resubmission. You're going to put on your boxing gloves and you're going to fight for 10 rounds, and then you're going to get it in. And so that initial no, it doesn't sting the way that you might think, or that, a lot of non-scientists might think, oh my goodness, I can't believe you got rejected. Well, I was sort of expecting the rejection. I was actually very much looking forward to reviewer comments to understand, all right, experts in my field think that we got this right and we got this wrong. And more often than not, with good peer reviewers, and if you go to the right journal and you have reviewers who actually care, they're going to guide your science in a way that actually improves the project in a way you couldn't have done yourself, right? And so I'm actually always very much looking forward to peer review comments that come with a no. And I take the no and I put it here. And then I take the comments and I absolutely absorb them, because, oh, wow, I didn't have that perspective. And so, there's been so many times where a no has actually informed research directions for my lab that then turn into a yes elsewhere. And it's hard to directly connect those dots, but you absolutely can. And so, I think, and Ian wanted to give a message to trainees, I think it's also very important, outside of the thick skin, which you'll develop, is, imposter syndrome is very, very real early in your scientific career, because you'll sometimes be in the room with Nobel laureates and field-defining juggernauts, and you're just a kid who's trying to figure out the difference between mitosis and meiosis, and You don't want to admit that to anyone, so you keep quiet and you keep your hand down. And my biggest regrets from grad school, and whenever I teach, this is the same thing I say, is if I'm talking, whenever I teach, if I'm talking for the next hour, you guys all did something wrong and you're not benefiting from your education, you should have questions because I'm teaching you something. And I think that imposter syndrome, just realize that Ian has it and I have it and Lora has it. And it's very important to be able to realize that the second you raise your hand, you've actually overcome way more than you realize, and you're going to learn and benefit from that. And so I hope some young folks are watching this and will realize that, the best thing you can do today is raise your hand and ask a question, whether you're in school or you're in college, you're at your job, anything. And you'll realize the person who you ask that question to is going to appreciate and respect you for caring enough to ask a question, right?
Yeah.
That's how you open doors also to collaborations and friendships and
Totally.
In the future. I remember I published a paper when I was a fellow that I was very proud of, but it was in a field where I was very a junior, obviously a fellow, and it was presented at a national meeting and discussed by one of the top people in this field. So you
Awesome.
can imagine
Yeah.
how cool that is, but at the
Yeah.
same time how nerve-wracking that is, right? They could totally tear apart your work. You just started in that field. They've been doing this for 30 years. Well, the person who did it, he was first of all very nice, very humble, very appreciative, and he spoke about it, and then we met, and that has become a friendship and collaboration for the
Awesome.
for the last 15
Yeah.
years, and plus I've been doing this, and so now it's like he considers me a peer. I still consider him way more knowledgeable and expert than me, but it's grown into this relationship. It's opportunities to publish together, to present together. He's given opportunities to do certain things. I've given him opportunities to do certain things. That's how team science is the best, is everyone's building everybody else up and helping everyone else succeed and progress.
Yeah, it's a really great club to be in, so to speak. I want to shift gears a little bit. We have been talking kind of more of the traditional paths. Let's talk a little bit more about what other funding opportunities are out there and what opportunities those could provide, either philanthropic, private. Can you guys talk a little bit about how maybe those funding sources have either helped your journey or maybe have inspired you to do something a little bit different?
I think those are incredibly important. I've looked for opportunities for non-traditional funding, as much as I can. And sometimes it kind of falls into your lap, honestly. I got an opportunity to do 2 grants with looking at GLP-1s and different nuts that are funded by 2 different organizations in the country, looking at pistachios and peanuts.
Wow.
Those are not areas that I would have looked at or gone online. It just kind of came up in this collaboration and it's been successful. And the other one is like American Heart Association, right? For those who are interested in cardiovascular and general health like that, American Heart Association and those type of societies have good funding that's easier sometimes to get grants than NIH, and the peer review is a little smoother sometimes. Doesn't take as long. I would say look for whatever opportunities you can get because they're helpful. I think philanthropy also, I wouldn't undersell that. I mean, I have a clinical program that is supported in large part by philanthropy, but we leverage for research, and people out there in the community who have means to support love research, like to be in cutting edge, like they have their own ideas about health that they want to ask about, and so there are plenty of opportunities to get through philanthropic funding for your research career. It's great for preliminary things, preliminary information, for larger grants. And then I would also give a plug for the CTSC, that all the pilot grants that we have, right, are really, I think, underutilized. We've been growing, year over year. I think more and more grants, people are recognizing the resources. But it's invaluable to have something like that because it comes from, CTSC is NIH funded. It's peer reviewed. It's very prestigious to get one, but it's a great opportunity to move science forward. So please look at the CTSC resources. Go to the website, become a member of CTSC, and and there's a lot of opportunity out there.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a shameless plug. The CTSC is actually invaluable to a lot of researchers who are looking to bridge, to just buy time in between funding decisions. And I'll chat about that in a second. But you asked about non-traditional funding mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So I will forever believe the NIH is the backbone of biomedical research, and forever it will be. So there's $50 billion a year that the NIH disperses to academic research labs and to private organizations to fund their research programs. And that's every academic researcher should continue to explore NIH as a viable sort of option, and in most cases, a first-line option. To speak on foundations and society grants, I think Ian did a good job of that, which is, there's a lot of organizations and charitable foundations that are looking to, build towards a cure for whatever disease that they're interested in. And there's multiple that we're engaging with now. Sometimes they'll solicit us. Oftentimes I will solicit them and say, hey, I know that you have this funding mechanism and you're looking for things like this. I think we can really provide not a solution. There's not a solution for much of this, but I think we can provide another brick in the foundation to try to get to a cure. Philanthropy is the one thing that I think I really want to stress on, which is in uncertain times and, with the current funding landscape being what it is, you'd be surprised at how many individuals are interested in building up healthcare and building up research and getting the backs of scientists. And, we've really benefited from, these can be high net worth individuals, or these can be your neighbor who just really care about the fact that at times it feels like science might be under attack, or science might be, not being the priority that it's been in years past. And, I don't want to get into specifics, but researchers can work with their development office. So Case Western has a fantastic development office that will make introductions. What I tell my dev office is I will have lunch with anyone. I will Zoom with anyone. I will go to their house and have coffee with them. If I can tell them over and over again why what we do is important and how every dollar they spend will go to either funding a trainee in my lab to be able to contribute to science, or to buying reagents that are going to help us run this experiment. And there's going to be transparent accountability for every dollar they put in. There's a really high ROI on philanthropic funding. And I think the smart, adept researcher in today's day and age is going to realize that, hey, it's time to go tell those stories. We built a scientific acumen, but we haven't built enough about how to tell our neighbors or our parents or, our coworkers just what we do, why it matters, and why funding it could actually lead to, really remarkable things. So reach out to your development office, and Case has a really great one.
Yeah. So I want to play devil's advocate for a second, because there's a lot of people and possibly listeners who have no clue what your research is,
Sure.
what a stem cell does, how it can be applied to multiple studies. And same thing. Why are we spending money on GLP-1s and, peanuts?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we make people care that we are spending so much money and we are investing in research? How do we make people care about that? Because in academia, within our communities and our networks, we care. We know. And so it's really easy for us to sit here and talk about this today, but we need to make other people care. And I'm curious what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, and I think disseminating your research and what you're doing to the community at large is very important. I speak at various places, invited to speak at functions where they have community members, they have lay people, and I do a lot of clinical talks as well, talking about the link between what we're doing clinically and what we're doing from a research standpoint to try to drive clinical success forward. And I think that the more people understand and appreciate what you're doing from a research standpoint, the more they can get behind it, whether it's with dollars or just generally supporting, research institutions in general. I think it's important. That's why the NIH makes you do these lay summaries, right? Because you might think, who's reading these things? But people go online. They search your research. They try to find out. And also the other thing that is people may be interested in joining research. So I do a lot of clinical trials, and so we would try to recruit people who like the idea of helping research and helping science may participate in your trial. They may have friends to participate in your trial. And it really just improves the whole idea of research generally. The more and more we kind of go away from real science to pseudoscience in some ways in society, the less people realize that real research, true research helps drive medicine forward. Cures, for example, like Amar's trying to find. And so we need that. We need everybody on board to understand how important research is for society as a whole.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's efforts like this too, which are it's time to humanize the scientists, and it's time to humanize the institutions as well. So, Ian is a world-renowned cardiologist. I know he had egg whites and milk for breakfast today. I was on the treadmill this morning watching the new Batman movie. And, then we go to work and we put on a different cap and we try to go, be as effective as we can. But there's things we're interested in. There's hobbies, there's interests, there's the fact that we care about our communities and we're on the PTA at our kids' schools. And, I play pickleball with my wife. I think it's really important to realize that, we are not behind a sort of a curtain. There's no shroud that's in front of us. And the biggest issue has been the lack of engagement between researchers in the community. And, we're at fault as well. So I could point 1,000 fingers, but when I call my parents on my way home and they ask, "How was your day?" I just say, "Yeah, it was pretty good." They don't really know what I'm doing or why it matters or how, we study age-associated heme malignancies. When you get older, your stem cells get defective, and that leads to a rise in incidence of things like myeloid disease. I've never told my parents that, who are an aging population, who actually, would benefit from that information. And so, we are to blame. I think actually the entire burden comes on the researcher to find ways to engage their community, their family, their coworkers, their kids. And so, things like this are great. For a while, I think, if we could engage with local publications, we can do this on the local level, which is let's tell Clevelanders why Cleveland biomedical research institutions and healthcare systems are the absolute best in the world and why we are so good at what we do, in large part because we have an infrastructure here in Cleveland that allows us to sort of survive and thrive. And so, I'm hoping things like this podcast really, open folks' eyes to the fact that, Ian and I are here and we're regular people who get to go have really cool jobs and we're grateful for them. But, I would love to be able to be out there more.
Yeah. Okay. So as we wrap things up, I want to give you both an opportunity to talk to our viewers and to say, here's maybe one golden nugget of advice. You've given some really great advice along the way is really to just kind of keep an open mind. Don't let things, get you down. But what is something kind of maybe oddly specific that you could think of that would be beneficial? If it's somebody applying to their first grant, right? We have a mock study session coming up. So this is an opportunity for somebody submitting a K, an R, a T, finding that opportunity, getting some really helpful feedback in a positive environment, but we don't have those all the time. So what is something that they could maybe retain in the meantime?
The first thing I would say is, let's say if you're going to write your first grant, find 3 people who have written the same grant and been successful, get their grant from them, read through it, see what you think about it, what you think maybe worked for it, find out what the summary statements when they got back their feedback was, and take those and do your grant based upon the learnings that you did based on those 3 grants. Because the successful grants, these reviewers read hundreds and hundreds of grants, right? So the most successful grants are the ones that pop out to them, that somehow jump off the page. It's a lot of grantsmanship that people do, and a lot of these cool techniques. Don't be shy about asking someone, "Hey, can I read your grant? Can I see your grant?" The people will give it to you because a successful grant breeds more successful grants. I think that's what I would do. The first thing you're going to start is get someone else's grant and read it.
Yeah, and the reason that's great advice is to anyone watching this, you have a K23 award winner and a K99 award winner who will send you our proposals when you want them. So, get our email addresses, and if you want your very first one of 3, I think there's 2 right here that would be willing to send them. The second is mine is probably more philosophical. I don't feel like I'm in a position to give advice on how to be successful in academic science because I'm still figuring that out, and we're still navigating sort of how to be stable and confident. And maybe that never comes, but I don't think I can tell someone, "Hey, go do this and it'll work." My most important thing is prioritizing mental health and well-being. It can be a very dark industry. It doesn't have to be, but I've seen a lot of people just sort of get so lost in the minutia of their science that they lose the individual. And it's a really sad and scary thing to see where, I think this can be part of your life, but it should not be your whole life. And, what I tell everyone in my lab is, hey, go have fun. You guys are young. Like, you don't owe me Saturday evenings here. In fact, I don't want you here Saturday evening. It's time to go make friends, go on a walk, call your parents, read a book, do something. And so I think finding that balance between how can I be a happy, well-rounded individual and then also be a badass scientist, sorry for swearing, I think is a really great balance and a sort of secret recipe to a happy life, which is it's okay to not think about it sometimes and to go, swing a baseball bat or go jump as high as you can in the air and just, breathe in the cool air. And so, I think it's very, very important. And this is an industry that suffers from a lot of depression and mental health issues because, a lot of our, as we talked about earlier, a lot of our self-worth is determined by an increasingly narrow pay line, which is just silly. And so my advice would be, hey, just realize that there's many facets to an individual, and your work can be one, but all the other things are what are actually important.
Yeah. Wow. These are really great words to live by from both of you. And I just want to thank you both for your insights. While funding and publishing can be really challenging, it is also very rewarding. And clearly, from the two of you, that's very apparent. So I thank you for your wisdom and your insights today. And if our viewers are watching and you are maybe stuck or you have some questions about funding, we of course now have 2 volunteers that will be readily available to take your questions, but also through the CTSC. I mean, we have proposal development opportunities. We have scientific editing opportunities. We are here to support your grant submissions, revisions, resubmissions, all the way. So I appreciate your time. And we thank you so much for joining us. So until next season, thank you for watching From Research to Real Life.
From Research to Real Life is brought to you by the CTSC of Northern Ohio. The views, recommendations, and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the presenters and not necessarily of CTSC and its partners.